By the turn of the millennium, the phrase open world sandbox only partially existed, setting itself on one giant map as opposed to branching levels, and instead of a fictional fantasy world with magic, most of these games are set closer to the present. It was a stretch where multiple developers worked on similar ideas, including Shenmue, Mafia, and Grand Theft Auto 3. In hindsight, it was a race to see who could change the landscape of video games forever, and Rockstar beat the rest to the punch. Now, it's not like the rest finished near the back of the line, given their own place in history. One of them was the Getaway, which set itself in an almost 100% accurate recreation of downtown London, and utilized motion capture, facial animations, and dialogue all simultaneously for performances which had never been seen before. Though it received polarizing reviews, you either loved it for its attempt to also recreate a British gangster film in video game graphic form, or hated it for its clunky controls, linear structure, cryptic nature, and inconsistent difficulty curve, pretty much everything else about it. It was commercially successful, selling over 3.5 million copies, and has received a cult following in recent years. After the game's release, director Brendan McNamara returned to his home country along with a few extra team members to form Team Bondi, and take nearly 8 years to make one video game, a good one at least, while the rest of the London studio were being worked to death, making games left and right including SingStar, iToy, This Is Football, and a follow-up to The Getaway. Initially planned as an expansion, like an add-on for levels in SOCOM US Navy SEALs 2 or Gran Turismo Concept 2002, and the end of the year was confirmed by Sony as a full game, and was released the next year on December 2004 in North America the next month. I didn't even know there was a sequel until I was researching the original Getaway, since the whole series flew under the radar for me. But I eventually found this copy at an antique store of all places, a copy that I've held onto for over a year, just waiting for the right time to review it, and it's finally arrived. Since it's a direct sequel which creates the events for this game, a minor spoiler warning ahead.
It finally looks like we've got all our problems under one roof, doesn't it?
After the events of the first Getaway, which ended with nearly every gang in London literally disappearing with a bang, the next 2 years left only Mark Hammon's former gang, the Collins crew under new leadership, and the Yardies, both in a war against each other. And this gives the Russians, the thieves-in-law ran by Victor Scoble, a chance to expand their operations to London with ease.
We've been offered transit, weapons, cash, houses, anything. London has no idea what's about to hit it.
Which sets up the events for our three protagonists. Former boxer turned trainer Danny West has recently gone into a gambling debt with the Collins crew, and decides that the only way to pay it back is to pull a heist. He chooses the Scoble main kid and sets up a team including Eddie O'Connor, who sees Danny as a lifelong mentor to him, and Sam Thompson, an acrobatic computer hacker.
Oi, you old enough to smoke? Is she old enough to smoke?
I'm old enough to do a whole load of stuff you never dreamed of, Eddie O'Connor.
And plan to steal credit card codes and a small religious artifact. However, underestimating how powerful the Russians are, the plan goes belly up, with members of the heist and the Collins crew being captured and or killed, including Danny himself.
Sockers are trying to deal with it, but they need backup.
Why us?
It's a gang shooting. The Collins crew are involved.
Meanwhile, Sergeant Ben Mitchell has just been cleared and reinstated as a police officer after killing an armed teenager during a chase, and is immediately tasked with investigating and subduing all these shootouts triggered by the botched heist, eventually rescuing a journalist, Jackie Phillips, who fearlessly tries to expose the entire thing.
Sergeant Mitchell, I'm sure you're very good at your job, but I warn you, a few cop cars won't put these people off, you know.
Basically, with Eddie seeking revenge for the death of his mentor, Mitch seeking justice as a street policeman should, and Sam, well, wanting to prove her worth and talent in the criminal underbelly of London, they all share the common goal of stopping the thieves-in-law trying to overrun the city.
Breaking silence is death. Life is cheap when you can bring in 30 more in the next freight.
Like the first game, it's the tale of two towns, three, with the story jumping between multiple characters, which is a good way to interact through different perspectives.
Sir, we don't know where it is.
Not yet.
The developers try to implement flashbacks to improve character development and give the player a brief glimpse of what could happen near the end, since it also has alternate endings. I won't spoil it, but I do know that I got the best out of the 4 possible endings on the first attempt, even if the music made it sound like I got the worst one. You know what, the story of Black Monday is actually pretty good once you understand what's going on. If all these cutscenes were shot on these angles in real life, it'd work as a film or TV show as intended. Everyone has an interesting backstory, the dialogue dialogue, the banter, particularly with the police, could be improvised for all I know, and actors are casted properly, especially the late Dave Legano, who grew up in London and boxed in real life. I hope I pronounced his name correctly. Despite this, I don't know, I'm not as invested in the characters. Maybe because Mark Hammond is a bit more sympathetic with what happened to his family right at the start, providing a genuine sense of hopelessness the first hour of gameplay. And Frank Carter, I love the way he gets told off and just gives it back to them all for the sake of justice. It was satisfying to watch. The way events play out, it feels more predictable and by the numbers with no sense of humour. I mean, look at the main antagonist, Victor Scoble, who's the polar opposite of Charlie Jolston. It makes sense, his gang is successful, they're ruthless, and Russian gangsters in London featured prominently in British crime media around this time before and after, including Snatch, Eastern Promises, and Rock'n'Roller. What's interesting though is Victor being referenced by Eyebrows in the first Getaway as the Russian geezer.
Now, we've got to have some Russian geezer, the pineapple's right to come by.
Probably coincidental since it's only mentioned once, but a good way to connect both games without any noticeable plot holes. It's the little details that make the story better than first impression. However, to make sense of it all, you need to have played the predecessor and go straight into Black Monday with the realization that it's a new story with new characters with very little references to the previous title, and yet noticing them improves the experience. And it's easier said than done because the gameplay time to beat it is the same length as a few TV episodes. You're playing as multiple characters where despite the long cutscenes, you're spending more time shooting, punching, and sneaking. There's nowhere near enough time to get invested in the characters, and too much back and forth between certain parts of the story to comprehend what's going on. It felt like it came to its conclusion too fast and then just restarted like nothing happened.
That's all we got. We've been having trouble.
You do surprise me.
But the worst offender, I'm finally gonna let out what a lot of people are thinking, because for many it's the first thing that comes to mind when we think of Getaway Black Monday. Sergeant Mitchell's head is too big.
What are you gonna
Hey, ladies! Downstairs now.
Like a Getaway pop vinyl, or if I turn on the DK mode cheat in GoldenEye 007. Already I can't take the game's story seriously when Mitch is always looking around like he's blind.
Hello, you found me! Mission complete, I'm here!
I know it's ridiculous to criticize the plot because of the shape of a character's head, but that's how distracting it is. In fact, don't you all think the rest of the Force have oversized heads too? Is it the outfit? Is it a tribute to the Thunderbirds? I shouldn't have to ask questions like this in a game where motion capture and cinematic level performances are supposed to be the biggest strength to distract us from the rest of the game's issues.
You've no idea what I'm capable of. Nobody does. To you, I'm just another faceless cop.
Aside from the Force, the rest of the characters look fine, although Danny West looks more like he's closer to Sam's age than an old man on first impression. The developers use the same techniques of capturing movement, facial animations, and dialogue all at the same time, which, according to them, provide better performances from the actors since it's a more natural approach compared to talking from a script in a sound booth. Even though it's a sequel, back then this approach was ahead of its time, and you can argue that along with other cinematic influence franchises in the early 2000s, it set a template for video games today. But compared to the first Getaway, visually, it's really hard to critique since at least 90% of game files and technology have been recycled for Black Monday. Just a new script to work with and without the hype of having a fully recreated London and photorealistic characters. Again, this is a highly detailed 21st century London, the real main character that shapes these sidekicks, if you will, and their own stories and motivations. The posh main menu dashboards, the soundtrack that's classical with a modern remix, they all fit with the game and its sophisticated villains perfectly this time round. Though I wish they could have picked a better time of year to set the story since the skies are so grey and cloudy the whole playthrough. I suppose it sort of fits with the depressing mood the story goes for. There are also more vehicles with up to 70 real-life brands and more opportunities to drive the fast ones, including motorbikes, but unless you use the brake and accelerator with the right analog stick, hopping on one of these is like saying, I actually don't want to progress through the story because of how susceptible you are to crashing. Not as much as I was initially expecting, but I recommend a car.
How fast can you move this thing, Mitchell?
Additionally, the developers would have updated the textures of some of the buildings to portray London 2 years later. Though this is just a guess, because it's hard to compare both games since the predecessor didn't have a map system, so I never knew where I was. The only moments where I recognized something from the first Getaway were Big Ben, Buckingham Palace, and the police station where you had to find Yasmin. Remember her?
I don't know whether to admire your expertise or marvel at your stupidity.
I drove past it in the middle of a car chase. What are the odds of that? I guess that's one plus side to implementing a near 100% accurate recreation of a city for an open world game. Whenever you follow it up with a sequel and it's set in the same city, what are they gonna do? Make a different map considering the lengths they went to recreate London for the first Getaway? Well, since the series uses a linear structure, fortunately they had the decency to create all new levels for every chapter from the ground up, so 95% of the time you're driving and shooting somewhere completely different throughout the story.
Urgent call from Shoreditch boys. Awaiting backup.
Let's go. Quick before the situation gets out of control.
Try and get us there in one piece.
However, one thing Black Monday does a better job at is getting you familiar with how the gameplay works. Cars don't slide out after the tiniest of bumps, they take more damage, traffic isn't as heavy on the roads, but best of all, you actually have a map system. It's basic as basic can be, like it can't recognize any alleyways, but anything beats not having one at all. Trust me on that. I'll never forget the terrible first impression the first Getaway gives you. No instructions, no dashboard, a time limit which can only be indicated from sound cues, not knowing which car is the enemy one, that indicators are used as visual directional cues. You had to know everything right from the start. It's likely due to the story and situations Mark Hamill got into. Everything goes from 0 to 10 in a snap, so the gameplay has to match that level too. But in Black Monday, while it still has no HUD, cars don't slide out nearly every time you go around a corner, and the difficulty curve makes life more tolerable. So when these crazy car chases and high volume enemy encounters occur, it doesn't feel overwhelming for all the wrong reasons.
They're everywhere.
I ain't impressed.
Units, roadblock to the hub. Repeat, we are shutting down the area.
The experience from the first game also allowed me to adjust to the limited controls a lot more easily. I remember failing at least a dozen times on the first chapter alone. But in Black Monday, I only failed an average of 2-3 times per chapter the entire playthrough. This is a lot easier than the predecessor because, like being on the road, the difficulty curve is better structured since you start as Sergeant Mitch, who has more allies on his side during gameplay. They're actually useful.
Do you read the paper, Arv, or just eat your chips out of it?
Oh, you're killing me.
He has an arrest button which instantly subdues the enemy with the press of a button.
You're under arrest.
Nyet.
Then you go from that to Eddie, who uses his fists mostly, and Sam, who can't use a weapon, relying on stealth.
See? I know what I'm doing.
Jumping between both characters with everyone wanting them and their crew dead. I'll give it a little bit of credit for increasing the variety. In fact, there are special features outside the story which basically answer the question, what would a driver game be like if it had a London map with all its game modes including chase, race, cab fares, and free roam to enjoy the sights and sounds of London, according to the mission brief. They're fun for about 5 minutes at most, and basically expose the game's flaws even more, including cramped streets, slow vehicles, and broken physics. The latter I'll also get to. Anyway, back to the main story. Make no mistake, I still walked around aimlessly, wondering which button did what. Already opening the manual after 2 minutes, thinking to myself, yep, this is what I've come to expect. Like the first game, the lack of a dashboard is deliberate to add to the cinematic style. So, unlike pretty much every video game which has one, the Getaway works around it by using sound, dialogue, and animations to give the player an idea of what Mitch, Eddie, and Sam are feeling. Like music cues, allies telling you what to do next, the characters telling themselves they need more ammo, or moving slowly like they're hurt and need to rest for more health.
Almost out of ammo.
However, it's very easy to be hit with the occasional WTF moment where it takes a second attempt to go, okay, that makes sense now. It usually occurs in the heat of the moment when you didn't know what was said. For example, when I had to reach a waypoint without being chased by the police, it was until I failed and had to drive from one side of London to another all over again, I realised at some point Sam suggested to switch vehicles during the chase.
Need to get damage without the filth on our tail.
Let's try and have a motor then.
Another type of confusion occurs when navigating through large levels since there's no arrow telling you where to go. for the most part. Expect to be fooled into thinking you're at a dead end when it actually isn't. I'm not saying it's flat out cryptic every chapter, just don't be surprised to miss a door or pathway seeing the same pile of dead bodies every once in a while. Don't get me wrong, these are highly detailed level designs, especially the ones indoors. I wonder if these places exist in London in real life, only taking a few liberties gameplay wise, i.e. cover or enemy placement. Like, is this an actual boxing gym, bank, scrapyard, or blue movie studio? The developers even researched police protocol, which is why in this chapter you go through the back alleyways to reach an underground station in order to reach criminals faster. Apparently that's how bobbies operate down there.
Jesus Christ, no!
Good shot. You compare how interiors look to its rivals, it looks very realistic during the PlayStation 2 years.
This is Mitchell. No backup required. Repeat, I can take him. Stay back.
Got him. He's down.
However, the novelty wears off when you actually play the game. Yes, it's better structured to work out how the controls work compared to the first Getaway, but it doesn't take away the fact that it's just as sluggish to control where the character moves slowly, like they weigh 100 pounds heavier than they actually do. Whenever there's a moment to platform, it's just one button that performs all the actions, and the camera? Good lord. It might not look like a big deal watching the gameplay, but if I was only allowed to fix one thing about the Getaway titles, it's this. It's not as bad as the predecessor since you can sort of control it with the right analog stick, but you still can't rotate it around the character and it still jolts all over the place trying to stay in front, making it easy to be blindsided by enemies, so expect a few instant deaths out of nowhere. It seems like whenever you get into a shootout, your instinct is repeatedly press R1, which automatically locks onto the closest enemy. While faster paced, there's no sense of strategy on what should be the most exciting moments on foot. There's also an option to manually aim for better accuracy, but it's impossible to use without taking damage since you have to be out of cover and standing still.
Come on! Hey!
And with the stealth-based chapters, particularly with Sam, since the whole point of missions like these is knowing your surroundings at every corner, as you can see, I'm really trying my best to make sure an enemy doesn't blindside me, having Sam positioned in a way that I can view the hallways, but the cameras simply won't let me. These parts of the game are sort of designed in a way that it's not completely necessary with enemies standing still, but it doesn't make it more fun, and it's easy to accidentally make a wrong turn. The whole thing is an all-around disengaging experience with few minor changes that don't actually improve anything, and as a result you find yourself loopholing the game's shortcomings.
I just want Hector. What? Can't take it?
And if you think it's for the sake of realism or cinematic merit, the fluent movement that characters can't see these details like ammo or health stats with their own eyes, well, as you can see from the gameplay, I'm rolling as often as I can into enemy gunfire because it's the only way to collect a weapon taking as little damage as possible. Sounds ridiculous saying that out loud, doesn't it? By the way, melee attacks do more damage than bullets. Keep that in mind when in a boss battle with one of Victor's cronies. There's no strategy either, just hope you get the first punch before the enemy.
Trying to scare me.
So I'm not buying that argument because if it was realistic, these gang members wouldn't come across as a bunch of clueless bellends. Seriously, you can roll non-stop at the enemies and almost never take a single bullet. Even if they're right next to you, they stop firing their weapon after the animation ends. They'll keep aiming at you but not do anything else, sometimes move away. Probably because they're so overwhelmed by Sergeant Mitchell's giant bobblehead.
I ain't the liability around here anyhow.
That's the one thing about Getaway Black Monday that's significantly worse than the predecessor. How unfinished the whole thing feels. Going back to the road, it gives true crime New York City a run for its money when it comes to bollocks car physics. Whenever you hit something, it feels like you're stuck to it for a millisecond and keep going rather than crash into it. There's no consistency in the hit detection between other vehicles. And staying behind a target, it sticks to a locked path so willingly, just look at it.
Gotta shake him.
And eventually, the game will hinder your progress to the point of being virtually unplayable. When I tried to get into this bank, I wasn't allowed in at first, tried the other gate, it worked, but the building was completely deserted. I tried this highly detailed car park, also deserted. Yeah, something wasn't right. I restarted, then I heard Sam suggest that I steal one of their vans. Okay, now there are enemies. But the fact I was able to enter an empty building because I went past this gate without one of their vans sounds weird, right? Well, guess what? That's not even the weirdest moment.
I'll pretend I didn't see that.
This chapter here, firstly you die before you even know what's going on with the game not loading properly, but once I figured out how to escape and eventually stop the van, the first time, okay, I won't forget this anytime soon. Because the woman I was supposed to save, Jackie Phillips, she got out of the car next to another one, she became stuck to it, and, well...
Watch out!
Mitchell, wait.
Sarge, where are you?
Just passing through you.
In hindsight, after I was able to finally complete this mission properly, it's hilarious. But from a reviewer perspective, this is clearly not a good look. Because how can you do worse than this?
Hold on, wait.
Well, the game crashing entirely. Oh wait, that happened to me as well, right upon the completion of a chapter and had to do it all over again. Thank you very much.
Now who's laughing?
Yeah, what have
That's right.
AAA titles being released unfinished has been a huge talking point over the last 12 months, and that's putting it lightly. But imagine that, but the developers not having a chance to update it. That's what the Getaway Black Monday feels like. I think because it was originally planned as an expansion, the developers initially thought they only had to work on the game's strengths. But once it shifted to a full-fledged sequel, players expected more than just a new story. And it's not like they didn't receive any feedback from the predecessor. All they did here was update the textures on the buildings, the cars, and just recycle the rest. It's basically an expansion marketed and priced as a full game, overcooked and undercooked in many different areas. And I'm sorry, I don't like it, and I can't see myself replaying it ever again now that I've reviewed it. I know it's not as frustrating as the predecessor gameplay-wise, and the story isn't too shabby either. It's a different experience after playing through the last game, knowing how the gameplay works for the most part in advance. Although that can also be a perfect indication that there's absolutely nothing changed in the gameplay. Therefore, lack of innovation, more style over substance, and in many noticeable aspects too broken. Just because it's not as hard doesn't make it better overall. And aside from a PlayStation Portable spin-off that I haven't played yet, Gangs of London, that was it for the Getaway franchise, with a couple of nearly moments including a PlayStation 3 sequel that was cancelled in 2008, a PlayStation VR title that was initially based on the Getaway became Blood and Truth, and the closest thing to a rumour was last year where London studios advertised jobs for a new project, hoping to be you know what. I sincerely doubt that, but does it deserve a successor or remake after nearly 2 decades of advanced technology? Now I know I'm not a fan of the series, but personally, yes. There's clearly demand for it, and the open world genre is still red hot in gaming today, but only if it's in the hands of good developers. And you know what, I think London studios themselves are up to the task if this was their sole focus. Just imagine a present day London with the same story set nearly 20 years later, but with PlayStation 5 technology and hopefully improved gameplay. I'd buy that for £60 on launch day, but whatever your take is on the Getaway series, there was certainly nothing else like it that generation. Just don't expect me to replay these two anytime soon.